well, we'll get started. Thank you everyone for joining us in the room and for our guests online. My name's Michelle Isles and I'll be your host for this evening. I'm from the Gippsland Climate Change Network. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners, the Gunai peoples. I recognise their sovereignty was not ceded. I recognise their ongoing cultural connection to land, water and skies. And that connection has endured through great transition and change. And so there's a lot that we can learn if we listen about better ways to care for country and also through that experience. So we don't have a Gunai representative here today, but let's keep listening and hearing from Gunai leaders and community in our discussions and beyond. I also recognise any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are here in person and also online. And welcome to all of you. Some of us who have had the chance to gather prior to this event starting have had some great yarns. There's people that have known each other for a long time and some have just connected this evening. And there's a great opportunity tonight in hearing from our speakers and guests to take some of those conversations forward into action. We'll hear from obviously our guest speaker, Mark Wakeham, who will be known to some of you, many of you in fact, here in Morwell. And he'll be sharing examples and learnings and insight from his Churchill Trust Fellowship, which was exploring just transition for climate change. Mark will present and I'll invite questions. And then we'll hear from some of our local leaders, sharing their perspective and plans on transition in conversation with us so that we can pave a way forward. So it's a really critical time here in Australia and I'm sure we all feel it here in Gippsland. Climate change is no longer something that's predicted, it's something that we're experiencing. Having worked in the health sector, the storms and the floods and the extreme fires have affected our lives and experience. And that ambition to reduce emissions is live. It's a live conversation and the action is happening as it should and needs to be. So government and business and community leaders have been talking and are now making plans, active plans around this. Large-scale renewable energy is already embedded in some of our landscapes. We've got a designated renewable energy zone with a $54 billion pipeline of more than 25 projects proposed. And many of you in the room are actively involved with offshore wind. Here in Gippsland we'll see the first wind development and transition. But in talking with many of you before this event started, this conversation is not new. And so here we will hear from and hold the conversation not only about the infrastructure, but about people and environment. So I'm really excited about what we'll talk about tonight and hearing from our really considered and informed speakers and leaders. So let's get started. So I'll just invite Mark to come up. But Mark will be known to many of you because he's got over 2 decades of experience working on climate sustainability policy, campaigns and communications. He's an experienced board director, CEO and change maker. He's the Australian Program Director of the Sunrise Project, a board member of Sustainability Victoria, senior advisor, as some of you know and have worked with him on climate change and energy and just transitions, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, former trustee of the Reichstein Foundation, and of course he served as CEO and Campaigns Director of Environment Victoria for a decade. Mark has deep expertise on climate, energy and sustainability issues, systems and solutions. He holds a Bachelor of Arts, History and Commerce Economics and a graduate diploma in adult education. He's a graduate of the Australian Institute of Directors and of course the reason he's here tonight was awarded a Churchill Fellowship in 2020. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Really good to be here. Thanks very much for coming along and spending the evening with us. I used to come down to the Latrobe Valley a lot when I was working for Environment Victoria. I always enjoyed it. Really nice to be down here again and seeing a bunch of familiar places and also some new ones. I will bring up the presentation. Oh. There we go. So, just because you haven't seen enough photos of me, I was a bit intimidated in the foyer by all the pictures of me. Here's another one, way too good. I'm going to talk about the Churchill Fellowship. Churchill Fellowships, about 100 of them are granted each year in Australia. It's an incredible opportunity if any of you have ever had any interest in exploring how other countries are dealing with matters of public interest. And it can be a very wide variety of topics. I was awarded one to study successful energy transitions, and I spent 6 weeks in Spain, Belgium, Denmark and Germany, and a few days at the end in Italy, and learned an awful lot. I mean, you can only learn so much in 6 weeks, but it is amazing how much you can learn. This is a photo I took on the first morning outside a union headquarters. UGT is a radical Spanish union that actually fought in the Civil War against the fascists. And as I got there for my first meeting on day one, there was this banner out the front of the union headquarters calling for a new environmental and social contract, which I thought was a pretty nice way to start a trip around just transitions. So I've called the report, so when you do a Churchill Fellowship, you don't just go and get to have a lot of great conversations with people, you do get to do that, but then you write a report when you come back. I've called it the visible hand of industry policy, which is a bit of an economist gag. Economists talk about the invisible hand in the economy determining how scarce resources are allocated. But what I found in all of the countries that I visited in Europe was that the governments were very actively holding the steering wheel and driving their energy transition. They definitely were not just leaving it up to the market. And so these are the chapters. I can't talk about all of these tonight. I'll focus most on those that I've marked up in green because I thought that they were probably of most relevance in Gippsland. So I'll start with Spain's energy just transition strategy, which from the conversations I had with trade union leaders, civil society, participants, government, industry, Spain probably has the gold standard in terms of just transition strategies. They're a few years ahead of us in their energy transition. So they're at about 47% renewables. And their climate policy has 3 planks, each with equal standing. They have their emissions reductions target, they have a national climate and energy plan, which includes renewable energy targets and energy efficiency targets, and they have a legislated just transition strategy. And that strategy has to be updated every 5 years by a just transition authority. It's agreed to, it's negotiated and agreed to by industry, unions and government. So tripartite agreements. The industry had been going through a lot of change. So the just transition framework and agreement in Spain is for phase out of coal mining, coal power and nuclear power. They started with coal mining, and in fact, they'd had a huge decline before they really got serious about their just transition strategy. They'd had a huge decline in coal mining anyway. They'd gone from 45,000 jobs in the late 80s to just 2,000 remaining about a decade ago. But then they got serious about thinking, well, how do we plan not just the closure of these mines, which were largely uneconomic, but also the power stations, both coal and nuclear, and develop these two tripartite agreements with unions and industry. So the National Just Transition Strategy identified the 14 most vulnerable regions. So, in their strategy, there are maps which show that the regions that are going to be most vulnerable to the transition to net zero emissions. And in Australia, we talk a lot about the regions, but we rarely actually identify them, name them, and then come up with a plan to actually mitigate the impact. There's a just transition agreement for each of those regions. There's a National Just Transition Institute who reports to the Minister for Ecological Transition. Isn't that a lovely ministry? and who also happens to be the Vice President and has been really, Teresa Ribera, very responsible for driving this strategy forward. Interesting. And of course, they also have resources. They have money from the Spanish government, 250 million euro, but they have access to the European Union 19 billion euro Just Transition Fund. And so when COVID hit Europe and they developed their economic crisis plan, instead of going for a gas-fired recovery, which we did in Australia, they decided to align their COVID recovery plan with addressing climate change. They increased their ambition of their targets, but they increased the European carbon price went up as a result, and they allocated 19 billion euro to regions that were in transition. And every country in the European Union can access that $19 billion fund as long as they provide a plan which provides some certainty around when coal closure is going to happen, what the plan is for those regions, what new industries they're trying to build. So serious dollars on the table. I'll leave, this is all in the report, by the way, which is online, but very, very clear process for developing the regional just transition agreements. And this is a summary of, the coloured regions are the parts of Spain that they had identified as most vulnerable. You can see, they've done the diagnosis of, all the issues for the region. They've run participation processes, and then they've, had dozens and in some cases hundreds of projects submitted for funding. And all of these projects, all of these regional just transition agreements didn't just involve unions, industry and governments, they also involved community. There was very strong community representation, and it wasn't just about the workers who were going to lose their job when the coal-fired power station closed. It was also about, the unpaid workers in the community, the carers, and other types of industries that were operating in those regions. And some of the companies also were involved in just transition plans and had committed significant resources in the tens of billions of euros. And I saw that this is Green Power, very large Italian utility. This is their plan for the closure of one reasonably small coal-fired power station called Churchill. And you don't need to understand all of this, but what it gets to is that there was really detailed workforce planning, the type of which we're only really starting to see happen in Australia. I think we saw a bit of this with Hazelwood, in a rush. We've seen it more at Liddell, where there's been a little bit more notice. But basically, they looked at every worker that was in the power station, looked at how many could be redeployed to be doing demolition and remediation, and they really made sure that the people who were losing their jobs in the power station or the mine were the ones doing the remediation and rehabilitation, which is something that we haven't always done in Australia. And then had a build-out plan for renewables that in the end actually was providing 1,400 jobs, more jobs than had been employed in the power station. So they were really looking at what's the plan over the next 5 years to create as many or more jobs. A lot of these are probably construction jobs. The actual ongoing jobs might not. Here's the total full-time equivalent. When the construction period finishes for those renewable energy projects, that number will fall, but it's still, significant employment from the initial 150 workforce. And, what you would find in their just transition plans in the regional strategies would not surprise you. They're the sort of things that communities like Latrobe Valley have been identifying as being the priorities for a long time. So it included things like eligibility for a pension at a younger age, retraining and redeployment programs for workers, carers being eligible for welfare payments, which is the welfare system is not as strong in Spain, and often there was unpaid work happening in a household. And if the paid worker lost their job, you need to value that unpaid work. And one way that the Spanish government did that, they actually changed the national welfare rules so that in these regions, these 14 regions, carers would be eligible for welfare payments. There was job banks to find affected workers work in site remediation and rehabilitation, and I know we've done that a little bit in Australia, but it was really a process where they were matchmaking workers and work over a period of years, 7, 8, 9 years. It wasn't just a set and forget. It wasn't a once-off. It was we're committed to this for the long term. Government investment in local infrastructure and services, efforts to attract private investment, and really importantly, tenders to connect renewable energy generation to existing grid infrastructure. I'll get to it a little bit later, but one of the themes, it's getting increasingly difficult to build renewable energy projects on land in Europe, as it is pretty much everywhere around the world. And so they view the sites of these coal-fired power stations and mines as incredibly valuable. And I met with a couple of the largest utilities in Europe and the greenest utilities in Europe. And they said to me, you never leave a power generation site in Europe. It's too valuable an asset. You repurpose it, you use it to generate electricity. It's so hard to get approval for a renewable energy project that might take you 6, 8, 10 years. Why wouldn't you start with a site where you're already producing energy? So that's a very quick whirlwind tour of Spain's Just Transition Authority. Now we're going to move to Denmark, and I don't have time to talk about how incredible Danish social policy is, but I do just want to share their origin story. And I think the story that every region or country tells about itself is really important. And I think in Australia, the story we have told ourselves about climate change for much of the last 2 decades is we're only about 1.5% of global emissions. We can't really solve the problem ourselves. Whether we stop climate change or not, we really will come down to what happens in China and India. Heard that story before. It's a pretty convincing story. It's why we've been hearing it for 10, 15, 20 years. In Denmark, they've been telling themselves a different story. Since the 70s, the birth of the environment movement there was when Sweden decided to build a nuclear power station a long way from Stockholm, a long way from the Swedish capital city, but very close to Denmark, just across the waters. And there was huge protest movements. Out of that was born the Danish renewable energy industry, and out of that started their monitoring of wind speeds, which led to some of the big engineering companies like Siemens investors decide actually there might be something in this wind power, and then become some of the largest companies in the world. The story that they are telling themselves, and everyone, so in Denmark, I was mainly looking at offshore wind, and I met with project developers, utilities, government officials, ports, shipbuilders, supply vessels, pretty much the whole supply chain of the offshore wind industry. And all of them told me the same story. And the story was, we're a tiny country. We only emit 0.1% of global emissions. So if we want to help solve climate change, we need to develop the solutions and export them to the world. Really powerful story. And they've really, they've built that into their climate policy. It's bipartisan. It doesn't matter who's in government. That's what they're pursuing. This was at basically the embassy for the environment in Copenhagen. When they hosted the Copenhagen climate talks, they realised that they needed a permanent place for visiting heads of state to come and learn about Denmark's green transition, and for punters like me. So I could talk about Denmark till the cows come home, but I can't. But I'm going to go to offshore wind. So this is the secretary of Dansk Metal, which is Danish metalworkers union, and also represent seafarers. And this guy, Ole Philipsen, basically curated a week's worth of meetings for me with everyone in the supply chain. And when I got there on the first morning to their headquarters, found that all the union's vehicle fleet was all electric. I promise you, if you go to the ACTU car park, they're not all electric there yet. Got a way to go. But at the back, there was this massive construction site they were building, that they'd surveyed their members about what was the most important issue for their members. And the biggest issue for their members was housing. In Copenhagen, they had a housing crisis. So they are building 700 units, ultra sustainable. The walls are about that thick, super insulated for their members and for their members' families. They were also building a kindergarten, childcare centre. They negotiated with the government that the new metro train line that was being built would have a stop right underneath their union headquarters. So very progressive union in a country where union membership is at about 80%, and about 90% of workers are covered by an enterprise agreement. And they told me that, so in these meetings, they were telling me basically that Denmark's always been a high labour cost country, and therefore what they've really had to focus on is technology and innovation, and being the first to develop these new industries and be at the front of those industries for 5 or 10 years and then work out what the next industry that was going to come along was. And because they have such a strong social safety net, for instance, unemployment benefits are really generous and they're paid by the union. One way to guarantee, higher rates of union membership, they're not paid by government, they're actually paid by the unions, which really embeds them in the community. But where was I going with that? Oh, I lost my thread. So, so the wind industry had been a really early focus of Danish industry to diversify. And there's now 10,000 Danes employed in the wind industry, and 47% of the power comes from wind energy, in addition to more from renewable energy. So what did I learn about offshore wind projects? Well, I learned that they're incredibly complex, and I know there's people in this room who will know this already. But I'm mainly not even going to talk about the actual wind farm. I'm going to talk about everything that needs to happen before you build your wind farm. So the first thing you need to do is have a port that is capable of withstanding the weight of all the equipment. And there's not many ports that are. Each of these foundations for this is the sleeve for the offshore wind turbines, they each weigh about 300 tonnes. If you've got 100 or 200 of them for a wind farm, that is a lot of weight. Most ports will need upgrading. They need access to deep water. They need quite a lot of space. Anyone who's tried to upgrade a port will know that greenies, people like me, can be annoying when you're trying to upgrade a port. There's a lot of work to do. Environmental effect statements can take years. So there's a lot of work just to get to the point where you have a port that can host the construction. Then you need one of these. You need a construction vessel. And because the global offshore wind industry is growing at about 30 to 40% every year, the scale of the industry is growing by 30 to 40%. Every single one of these that has been built is fully commissioned for the next 4, 5, 6 years. And so quite often, the first step, if you want to build an offshore wind farm, the first thing you need to do is actually commission one of these, get one of these built. There's only 3 shipyards in the world that are large enough and have the skills to build these ships. And at the moment, it's more profitable for them to build LNG tankers. So that's a bit of a problem. So, you've got to access your port, you've got to get access to one of these vessels. And if we think that we're going to get access to one of these vessels in Gippsland to build one wind farm, if we think that they're going to send, a construction vessel from the Northern Hemisphere when it's fully booked out to build one wind farm, we're dreaming. What we're going to need is industry policy. We're going to need government to be actively planning and curating a pipeline of projects in Australia. We may need vessels like these that are dedicated to Australian waters. We're going to be competing with other new emerging markets like the US, like Asia. So we've got to be really proactive in making sure that we have not just the boats, but also the people. And there's huge shortages in seafarers, particularly in the wake of COVID and war in Ukraine. A lot of seafarers globally are Russians and Ukrainians, and at the moment they're not at sea. So huge supply chain risks. Again, just to show the scale of this equipment, these were 15 megawatt wind turbines In the nacelles, you could have had a rave party with 80 or 100 people, and they probably do, given that it's Denmark. So again, construction vessels, they jack up on the floor of the ocean. You know, anyone who's been following the developments in Gippsland will know how these jack-up vessels work. You don't just need a construction vessel, you need the servicing and maintenance vessels. So for each offshore wind farm, most of them will have a supplier they'll have a contract with one of these ships to service that wind farm for 10 or 15 years. So this is why this is why the maritime unions love the offshore wind industry. There is a lot of jobs in this industry and they're very well paid jobs. So these ships work 12 months a year, 24 hours a day. There's crew on these ships. They go out to sea for either 2 weeks or a month at a time. And the workers, technicians, you know, climb out on the crane and service the turbines and clean the turbines in 12-metre seas. And that will have anywhere between 30 and 120 workers on it. And every single wind farm needs one of these. There's also a shortage of these boats. These take about 3 years to build. So again, you know, if we're going to have an offshore wind industry in Gippsland, we're probably going to have 5, 10 of those ships, and that's like 500 jobs in just the ship. This company, Esvagt, they are based in a town called Esbjerg on the west coast of Denmark, and it's a town of 110,000 people. So it's a little bit smaller in population than Gippsland. And they were a fishing town. And they were kind of a bit of a laughing stock in Denmark. They had a fish factory that they turned the fish into pet food. People used to laugh at the smell of town, and you know, that used to be the calling card of the town, the smelly fish factory. And then the fishery collapsed. And in the early 70s, the companies that were operated in the fishing industry decided to get involved in the North Sea oil and gas industry. And so a lot of the companies, this particular company included Esvagt, retooled its ships and did servicing and maintenance for offshore oil and gas. And now those oil and gas fields are in decline, and more than half of their business is in offshore wind. This one company in a town of 110,000 people employs 1,200 workers. They have about 30 of these vessels, and 52% of their revenue is from offshore wind, 48% from oil and gas. 7 or 8 years ago, it was 100% oil and gas, 0% offshore wind. And the highest paid workers in the North Sea are the wind farm crane operators, the ones who can, on the construction vessels, connect the blades with the nacelles in high seas, and those people are earning very large money. And example of, you know, Danish ingenuity, when the weather was too bad to be working at sea, they were manufacturing their own boats. So they were actually doing it all. That was as close as they would let me get to it. This was patented secrets. So I'm going to wrap. I want to finish very quickly with keeping European energy experts up at night and what's not. So I went to a big European energy conference in Brussels. A lot of it was focused on the war in Ukraine and the winter that they were about to have and how they were going to get through that. But the common refrains, renewable energy project approvals, the amount of time it was taking. And that's one of the reasons why particularly the wind industry was looking at these offshore projects. Skilled labour shortages. And that wasn't just in energy, that was everywhere. Disrupted supply chains and energy independence. So the war in Ukraine has totally changed how countries are thinking about where they get their energy from. They all now want to know that they can provide their own energy from within their own borders. And they're doing things which you wouldn't have thought would be happening. So, for instance, in Spain, they're building massive solar PV factories, like 1 gigawatt a year factories, when everyone thought that all of the solar manufacturing had gone to China and India forever. I've talked about ship and crew shortages. Energy affordability was a huge issue. Prices were going through the roof. and growing transport emissions. So nearly, well, most European countries, their electricity system was decarbonising at a very fast rate, but transport emissions were still rising. And things that were not keeping people up at night, which have given us a lot of, keep a lot of people up at night in Australia, transmission. People just didn't seem that concerned about it. They were getting projects upgraded, or alternatively, the existing infrastructure was fine. When there was offshore transmission infrastructure that needed to be connected, they were basically levying it on the projects and then just building it with public money. Reconnection. Some project developers in Australia, they build their renewable energy project and it takes months or even years before they can dispatch to the grid. I had a guy in Italy tearing his hair out telling me about his solar farm in Mildura, which he was still waiting for AEMO to connect. And it was kind of bizarre being told about a solar farm in Mildura. And coal closure. It's nowhere near as controversial as it has been in Australia there. And it's because they've just, systematised the idea of planning for closure, having closure dates, having just transition strategies, investing in the regions, and it's it just appeared to be a lot less controversial. This is my final slide. It's the socialist fraternal kiss. I took this photo in Berlin. It was supposed to show how tight the relationships were between communist countries. So it's the secretary of Soviet Union and socialist leader Erich Honecker, who was the East German president, and Leonid Brezhnev, who was the Soviet president. And the reason I wanted to show this photo was because it was pretty, like many of you have probably visited Berlin. It's a pretty amazing city, but this edifice, this wall, just seemed permanent until it wasn't. And right up until the day that the Berlin Wall came down, a lot of Germans could not conceive of it not being there. And in fact, the East German security apparatus and secret police were never more powerful than the day before the Berlin Wall fell. They were never more in number. Their numbers climbed throughout their sort of 40-year history. And on the day that the Berlin Wall fell, there were like 50,000 Stasi officers feeding documents into shredders. So people couldn't conceive of the change, and then it happened. And in being in Europe while there was war in the midst of this energy transition, just really reminded me of the quote. I think it's a Hemingway quote, which he said there are decades when weeks happen and weeks when decades happen. And it felt like in some of these weeks, like decades were actually happening. And even while I was away, the change was not just happening in Europe. While I was away in 6 weeks, AGL made its announcement about bringing forward coal closure and energy transformation strategy. Queensland made a very substantial announcement about bringing forward coal closure and building out a really massive build of renewables. And in Victoria, we resurrected the SEC from the grave. So change, stuff, and like that was thought inconceivable, I think, by many. But stuff that just seemed impossible became possible very quickly. So just worth remembering when we're navigating this energy transition that we're all in. Thank you.
Be able to hold it Dave right away. So now's the opportunity to ask questions of Mark. Thank you for packing so much in to that reasonably short brief. We've got this sense of that time ticking now. This transition's happening and needs to happen. There's a lot that we actually need to think about and get organised, but there's lots of smart people in the room and indeed online. And so we'll ask some questions from both the room and online. So please put them in the chat, and we'll see those. But first of all, Mark, I'll just to kick off, there was a lot in that, lots to think about. I was interested in the agreement in Spain, so the gold standard, as you put it. Gosh, there was, a lot of great thinking, but the agreement with different sectors and community, I think you talked about a social agreement. How does that actually
put into place. So how was that convened? Was there an independent body, or how did you get how did they get all of those different parties together in agreement?
So I think the Spanish Minister for Ecological Restoration and the Vice President basically spoke with trade union leaders and spoke with business leaders and said, we need you to come to the table and have this conversation, and we need you to bring your communities with you. And I met with a senior trade union official in Madrid who had gone out to those coal regions, had very difficult conversations with his members, and I had a bit of a stilted meeting with him because he didn't speak any English and my Spanish is not very good. But along the way, in the course of the meeting, he went over to his shelves several times and pulled up, here's the transition agreement for this region. and handed it to me. And you know how much talk there's been about, what's the transition plan for Latrobe Valley? Mm-hmm. Still, I don't know if you know of the document where here's the plan. Well, there was a plan that people had agreed to, signed off on, and had significant resources. So it took quite a bit of courage, and I think that the reason that it was possible for those union leaders and probably for those businesses to demonstrate that courage was because political leadership had created the space for them and promised them that there would be resources. They're still, subject to the vicissitudes of, changing governments. So they lost a bit of progress in the mid-2010s, but it was leaders deciding to lead.
Yes, yeah. Terrific. Sounds like there was real ownership and agency. Start taking some questions. If you can just say where you're from.
Mark Richards, Mining and Energy Union. Used to work at Hazelwood. Good to see you back down here again, Mark. For those who might not know, Mark and I worked together on policy back in 2018 for some stuff about change. I guess the part that I love to hear is we don't believe anything will change and it just happens. But what I'd say is the problem I see, and you've raised it very aptly here, is that, and I know you do give advice to the Trades Hall Council. When I was there a little while back, we had, I think, Senator Jenny McAllister, and we had Lily Ambrosio. And the question I posed to them was, I said, we're at the end of a supply chain. We're never going to get these targets. We're losing jobs in the Latrobe Valley. So why hasn't the state government invested, say, $12 billion in building a plant of some description to create these wind towers so that we can get jobs to offset the ones we're losing? And I'm wondering whether you could comment on what's the chance and what's the cost of getting something like that to help us meet the targets while achieving jobs.
Well, it's kind of the same story as, are we going to get these ships? Yes, if we have enough projects and if we organise them in a logical fashion. Are we going to get the manufacturing? Yes, but if you're going to open a big factory to build the wind towers in Gippsland, you're going to want to know that you're not building the factory for the next 3 years and that you can see 15 years of work ahead of you. So again, that needs to be pretty well organised. That's industry policy. That's not government leaving it up to the market. And I guess with the Victorian government's announcement, they have set targets for offshore wind and they're going to run auctions for offshore wind, or alternatively instruct the SEC to build offshore wind. That should give manufacturers a fair bit of confidence. The other thing I'd say is these offshore wind farms, the kit is so enormous that local manufacturing makes a lot of sense, just because the size to transport all of that kit, the weight in it. We're probably not going to be building nacelles in the Latrobe Valley, which is the engines in the Latrobe Valley, or maybe not even in Australia. We'll probably still be importing them. But the blades we could be manufacturing here, the towers we could be manufacturing here, the cabling we already are manufacturing here. We are manufacturing the towers in Portland, just not enough of them. So yeah, I think there's really big opportunities if we can commit to a large enough pipeline and stay the course, and not do what we did years ago when investors actually did set up a blade factory in the Latrobe Valley and there wasn't a pipeline of projects to keep it going.
Other questions?
Tony from LBA. Mark, just an interesting question. Why are they decommissioning the nuclear power stations? Because we hear the debate about nuclear being an option for green energy. So
because most of them are reaching the end of their operational life. Yeah. And When they are reaching the end of their operational life, you either invest significantly or you decommission them, and they are a costly form of energy generation, and renewables are providing much cheaper power. So most European countries, not all of them, like France is still very committed to its nuclear program, but Germany, Spain, actually I shouldn't mention any others that I'm not certain about, but Germany and Spain are definitely in the process of decommissioning their nuclear power stations.
Other questions? Thank you.
Mark, Simon Vanders. I've worked at Loy Yang for 20 years, so and now I work as a consultant in wind batteries and solar. So I guess I've had something of a transition myself in terms of my outlook and I guess work that I'm involved in. Just in terms of the offshore wind, you talked about renewables being the cheapest option in most cases. Offshore wind, correct me if I'm wrong, is about 2 or 3 times the cost of conventional wind. Yeah. So how are we going to keep pushing the cost of energy down if we're relying on greater levels of offshore wind when it's competing against conventional onshore wind and solar for $40 or $50 a megawatt hour?
Yeah, so I highlighted a bunch of the problems with offshore wind, in the complexities, I should say, the things that need, the problems that need to be solved. It is providing very large amounts of power. I don't know that 2 to 3 times cost. I don't think that's what they're experiencing in Europe. I think it might be 40 or 50% more cost. I must admit, I came away from some of that thinking, well, we've sure got a lot of land in Australia. You know, it's pretty complicated building them offshore. But the other valuable thing about the offshore wind is the profile, energy generation profile is different, and it tends to provide most power in the morning and the evening when prices are highest. So while it might be more expensive than wind in the middle of the night, it's blowing at the right time. So it's valuable to the grid.
Mark, Steve Dodd from Gippsland Trades and Labour Council. I know wind is, it's a popular thing now, offshore wind and that, but I think we're really limiting ourselves because, there's a number of other renewables around that I think we should be exploring also, like wave power, geothermal. I mean, we've got a swimming centre in Traralgon that's actually heated by geothermal at this very point in time. So I think really talking just about wind and how we get manufacturing going and how we get big boats here and all that sort of stuff, I don't think that's it. Hydrogen, coal to hydrogen is a proposal here, and I know, some people think coal's a dirty word, but depending on carbon capture, which some people say it works, some say it doesn't. But I really think the scope of what we should be looking at is a whole range of things, and I don't think that just offshore wind is the silver bullet for renewable energy. But one of the things that we really need to be concentrating on as a nation, when we talk about, looking after people, when we've got pensioners below the poverty line, unemployed people below the poverty line. What really pisses me off as an Australian is that we've got 750 multinational companies taking our resources and not paying 1 cent of tax. I mean, we've got to start focusing on what is important for us. I mean, countries like Norway, they don't get ripped off by multinationals. They're actually, any time you talk about tax against multinationals, the politicians jump up and go, oh, but it's sovereign risk. Places like Norway, they don't give a shit about sovereign risk. They've got a sovereign wealth fund. The reality is we have to change, and I just wanted to know what your view is about other things like geothermal, wave power, and whatever else may be offered.
So I guess one of the reasons I focus so much on offshore wind in that presentation is because I know that there's a lot of talk about it down here. And also one of the reasons I spent a week of the time doing a deep dive on it was because it's a very very rapidly growing industry that Australia is trying to get a slice of the action. And, you know, I think we've been talking about on land solar and wind for quite a long time. There wasn't quite as much to learn about that. But I agree, we're going to need like every renewable energy technology we've got. Problem is, some of them are developing at a much faster rate than others. Tidal and wave power, which, you know, I've had very high hopes for a very long time, have not been growing very much globally at all. They've been a bit disappointing, the speed of development of that technology. Geothermal in large parts of the world is fantastic for heat. It hasn't been quite so effective for electricity generation. But we're going to need it all, totally agree. On hydrogen, they were built, in Europe, there seems to be, most of the companies are having a bet each way on whether we're going to go down a hydrogen route or a methanol route. And they weren't talking about hydrogen projects, they were talking about power to X, which recognised that we don't know what X will be. But it's converting power into some form of concentrated power, whether it's hydrogen, ammonia, methanol. But the only places that I visited that were actually building hydrogen electrolyzers were building them at ports, and they were powering them with offshore wind. And the reason they were building them at ports was because they were hoping that they could sell the hydrogen to ships or the ammonia to ships that were fueling at the ports. I didn't hear of anyone proposing significant investment in fossil-based hydrogen power in Europe. And I was asking everyone about it. And I was going in there with, you know, eyes and ears wide open.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just bring in our online audience. We've got some local, obviously, leaders that we want to hear from as well. Chris Buckingham has obviously pointed to the Latrobe Valley Gippsland Transition Plan. So there is a plan, indeed, and there are some copies of that that we've brought here, so many will be aware. But there is indeed a plan, and Latrobe Valley, Shire Council, City Council, we're going to be here tonight and are able, but they've also put together a transition plan as it relates to the municipality. So there are some plans that are available, but I think what you're talking about is that next step of that agreement across the region. So thanks for reminding us of those. Adam Tyson's asked, is there bipartisan political support in these countries, or is the politics adversarial?
Most of the places that I visited was bipartisan. And again, in Denmark, what everyone said to me was, there's no disagreement about the direction of travel. Sometimes there's disagreement about the speed. So I think that's where the partisanship comes in. You know, speed, maybe preferred technologies, etc.
That's, you know, robust discussions, no doubt. But well, thank you so much, Mark. We are going to ask you to, well, you can keep having a seat there. We'd love you to. We're going to invite up our local speakers, but we'll start one by one. So we're going to start with a local legend in Chris Barfoot. So Chris, if I can invite you, you can come and stand where I am. I'll move out of your way. Oh, it's all right. So Chris is an engineer and scientist with extensive experience in all aspects of power generation, gained from over 30 years working in the power stations and mines of the Latrobe Valley. Chris has worked in power generation, brown coal mining, geology, boiler analysis, optimisation of works in major overhauls and workshops. Since leaving the brown coal industry in 2017, after the closure of the Hazelwood Power Station, he's been an integral part of the Gippsland Climate Change Network and has spent the last 3 years as the project officer of the Latrobe Valley Community Power Hub. Chris is a living example of someone that has transitioned with amazing skills that we're all benefiting from in our region. And so I'll just get to, here he is, Chris. And I'll let you take the stage and then.
Yeah, they asked me for my bio. I always said short, fat, old and ugly. That just confirms it. But unfortunately, I've got the boring presentation tonight. I've got the history. I am the ghost of transitions past. So I'm just going to talk to you about what we've already experienced. Now, when we started with the SEC back in 1920, we were all one family. When we built power stations, they got old. So we closed them. We built another one. And we did that with the Yallourn A, B, C, D, E, the Yallourn briquette factory. And every time we took those staff, we moved them across to the next one. It was good. But then we had another transition, which actually had nothing to do with power stations closing. And that was when we had our pre-privatisation. And in that case, we had 10,000 employees, and suddenly, inside a very short period of time, we had 4,000. We had 2,000 which were left into contracting positions. And that was a change that was devastating. That absolutely destroyed this area. And it was done with no support, no backup. We were just hammered and dumped. Now, I don't care what anyone does in the future, they'll never match that. That was our lowest point in history. So we move on to the next ones where we started to see closures. We started to see more briquette and power as it became known energy bricks, which was a very quiet closure as people just drifted away. And then we get to Hazelwood. Now, Hazelwood was old. I was in there maintaining a lot of it, working on the maintenance of it. My worst year I had there, I had 120 outages in a year. You've got 120 outages in there. You've got a problem because ideally you're aiming for 2 per unit, so 16 would have been ideal. 120, oh, you know you've got problems. And you know you've got problems when you get to that stage where your engineers won't walk around the boiler because they're concerned from safety aspects. And that's where we were. So did it close because of all the climate change and everything else? No, it was stuffed. That simple. So we come to Hazelwood. Now the thing with Hazelwood is they gave us a very nice greeting. We got a nice little message on the 4th of November of 2016. They gathered us all together there. I don't know if you'll find yourself in there, Mark. You're probably down there somewhere.
Somewhere.
It's him on the left there.
It could well be. I was at the front, so I took this photo looking at that. If you want to try and stand in front of a group of 800 people and tell them you're going to be sacked, that's what it looks like. That's a tough audience. The thing that came from that was how painful that transition can be. Because as soon as you change that situation and you put people into that difficulty of, oh my God, I am not going to have that income. How do I pay the mortgage? How do I maintain the family? How do I put the kids through school? People panic. And people panic, and one of the first things they do is because coincidentally, supposedly the board made that decision that night, and just coincidentally HR had all the packages ready for us to hand out the next day. Coincidence, of course. And one of the things that happens, of course, is people pick up that payout sheet and they look at the bottom line and it says, you get this much payout and your death benefit is. I can tell you, a lot of that 6 months, most of us in managerial positions spent our time on suicide watch and counselling with people continuously. It is not something I want to put people through into the future. So one of the great things that came post-Hazelwood was actually Alan Finkel doing his reports into how the power station should be managed. And the greatest gift he gave to us all was the fact that he insisted on a 5-year notice of closure on a power station. If you've got 5 years notice, you've got time to stop and say, do I have enough super? Do I not? Do I need to add to it now? Where do I want to be in that 5 years? Do I need to retrain? Can I start that training now? Can I start that development? It gives you that chance to build. And that is then leading into the 2 transitions, which goes to present and future, what we're speaking about. And the one that David is running, which I would call a collaborative or cooperative transition, as we're starting to see the thing. And then the one Christo's talking about, which is, what transition? I'm just building a future. But that's their stories, not mine. Thank you.
So I didn't consult with you on the phone.
Smile, Bertie. Bertie, smile.
They didn't supply you with a photo, did they?
Apologies, David Burt, other known as Bertie to many of you. You may know that he's a 40-year veteran of the Latrobe Valley power industry, having commenced with the SECV in 1982 as a commercial administrative officer. He's worked
5 at the time.
David has worked in a wide range of roles across the SECV, Generation Victoria, Yallourn Energy, TRU Energy and Energy Australia, including finance, human resources and community engagement. For 15 years, talking about looking after people, David led the people and culture team responsible for Energy Australia's energy asset sites. Since 2019, David has focused on building Energy Australia's relationship with local stakeholders, many of you here and online, and community as Energy Australia's community relations lead in the Latrobe Valley. David was also a former Moe City Councillor and chairperson of Powerworks. He lives in Traralgon, married to Maria, with son John, Jonathan, daughter-in-law Al, and enjoys his 2 grandchildren, Jude and Huey. Please welcome David.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to have a chat and just talk about the Energy Australia story in the Latrobe Valley. I guess I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Breakalong people of the Gunai Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I think for companies like Energy Australia, it's really important that we acknowledge traditional owners, the history and the culture of the place that we work in. And we see these projects as an opportunity to engage with the traditional owners and community, particularly around opportunities to inform and educate our own people, contractors, suppliers, and we work with traditional owners to look at opportunities as well. So, Michelle, are my slides through here or not?
No.
That's right, I can just talk to what I've got here. So I guess in terms of, I can just stand out here now.
Yeah, well, nice.
Great. So just in terms of Energy Australia, I think most of you know that we're one of Australia's leading energy retailers and generators. We'd probably argue we're the best, but there may be some in the room who would disagree with that. About 2.4 million electricity customers and a diverse workforce of about 2,300. We are investing heavily in the transition to clean energy. So we plan to be out of coal assets by 2040, and that will be when the Mount Piper Black Coal Station in New South Wales ceases operations. And as you're all aware, Yallourn will cease operations in 2028 after a century of contributing to the wealth and the power of the Victorian economy, and obviously providing many of us with roles and income locally. Tallawarra B is nearing construction in New South Wales. So Tallawarra B is an open cycle gas station which will initially also run with a 5% shandy of hydrogen, and we're looking to increase the level of hydrogen that gets burned into that station. But we are investing heavily in the regions that we operate to create new clean energy opportunities. We're investing in the Latrobe Valley through our Warreen battery storage facility at Geraldine. And we're currently exploring a whole range of opportunities for the Yallourn site. So I think Mark's comment around the Spanish views on power station sites. We're not closing into 2028, but we certainly are starting the work of looking at what the opportunities are for that site. So whether it's the overall size of footprint that we have of the land, or whether it's the actual power station building, we are looking at all those opportunities because it would be nice to close Yallourn in 2028, but a great story about the net loss of jobs being quite small. Just in terms of transition support for our people, so any transition, as we've heard from Mark, it impacts on regions, but importantly, it does impact on people, workers, families and communities.
So in our case, it's our Yallourn workforce, which numbers some 500 plus workers. And to support our Yallourn team, we announced last year, or launched last year, our Power Your Future program. The program is a $10 million support program, which offers a whole range of assistance for our people, including workforce planning, reskilling for futures beyond Yallourn, even helping our retirees plan for retirement. It includes customised career plans. So we kicked off our one-on-one sessions with our workforce back in February, and we've had a really good take-up of our workforce involved in that. That's looking at training options, credentialing of skills that people may have acquired in-house, financial advice, small business advice. We may have people who want to go to small business. But importantly, we are talking to those other renewable energy proponents in Gippsland, so Star of the South and others, and looking at the linkages between the skills that our workforce have, the skills that are required in those projects, and where the gaps are. So we've been working closely with the likes of TAFE Gippsland and Federation University to help to develop those training packages. Just in terms of the site, so yeah, it's a big site at Yallourn. So we're already starting to look at the opportunities for that Yallourn site. We see it as an opportunity to create prosperity through job creation and also livability options, hopefully through a filled lake with water. And our team are working on that now. So the important thing for us is that we have dedicated people looking at the transition piece. So I'm here just yapping, but there's people who are actually working in our teams looking at the workforce transition piece, the rehabilitation of the mine, the repurposing of the site. So that work has already started, but as you'd appreciate, we're really in that sort of, hey, let's find out what we're dealing with piece first of all. But we have got a little bit of time, but time is marching on. But we really want to get stuck into that work, importantly. The other thing I just wanted to touch on too is the Geraldine Power Station. So Geraldine's located literally 5 kilometres south of where we are now. It's a peaking station built in the late 70s and early 80s. And for most of its life, it's just come on intermittently when there's been a bit of a gap in the market. However, we're investing heavily in Geraldine to support its future role in renewables firming. So literally running a lot more to help us through that transition. So when we finally get the installed capacity of renewables that we're after, Geraldine will probably go back to peaking, but we think for foreseeable future, we'll see Geraldine running a lot more. So we are investing heavily on refurbishment and also building up a spares componentry for that station. At the moment, when something happens at Geraldine, we basically go off and try and get a replacement part or try and get it refurbished, and we lose a unit for an extended period of time. So the team out there at the moment are actually in the process of procuring a set of spares for those known failures on Geraldine. We see Geraldine really important moving forward. And while we're on the topic of Geraldine, the other piece that we've committed to is the Morwell energy storage system, and we should thank the Gunai-Kurnai traditional owners for the name Morwell, which in Gunai-Kurnai language loosely translates to the term light, and we think light is a pretty good translation for Morwell's role into the future. So we announced Morwell at the time of the Yallourn closure back in 2021. We haven't actually started building it, but we do have approval from the Victorian government to proceed now, which is great. It's 350 megawatts for 4 hours. So to keep that in context, one unit at Yallourn, stage 1 unit's around 350 megawatts. It'll have enough capacity to run for 4 hours, which is a great duration for a morning or an evening peak. And we think that it plays a really good role in time shifting renewable generation, which, it's unpredictable about when the wind might blow or the sun might shine. But, with a large scale battery storage system like that, we can actually, charge up when there's surplus energy around and then discharge for when it's needed. So that's kind of where we're at this stage. Real focus on guiding our own people through this transition.
Ready?
I'm sorry we didn't have images to go with those really important words. Thank you for your role, like just that telling the story of what's going on. I think is something that's really important. Understanding how everything's working and what's coming up. So having you here tonight is really important, and we'll look forward to hearing some questions about that. We have one last important panelist that's going to join us tonight. So I'd just like to, yes, I didn't consult on this slide either, I apologise. But here we go. So let me introduce to you Christo van Niekerk. Now, you'll know Christo because of his leadership role locally with AGL. But Christo began his career as an engineer in training at Eskom, South African electricity public utility. So there's a long history, a lot of wisdom in this group and panel. In 1987, and has since held various leadership roles throughout his career, including power station manager and senior general manager responsible for a portfolio of power stations in Eskom until 2018. His appointment as General Manager, AGL, Loy Yang, in 2021. Christo was involved in setting up an operations and maintenance organisation at a new coal-fired power plant in the Philippines, so until his appointment, I should say. But then his role in developing operations and maintenance processes and procedures was critical in managing the successful startup and ongoing asset management and maintenance of the new plant. Christo has university qualifications in industrial engineering, as well as a master's in business administration and a bachelor's degree in law. So thank you, Christo. I invite you to come out, and I'll just get one for your patience as we go through. You can use the clicker or just the...
Will do. Good evening, everybody. As indicated, I joined AGL in August of 2021. And in the next 6 months, we're getting ready for a demerger. Closure dates were changed from 2048 to 2040 to 2045. A couple of months later, we had to remerge and undo a lot of the demerge. And closure dates changed from 2040 to 2045 to 2035. So it's been an interesting 18 plus months since I've joined AGL, but it's been exciting to say the least. What I want to share with you, I mean, a lot has been in the news around AGL. I don't want to share things that you've read and that you're aware of. But in essence, during the revision of our strategic direction towards the end of last year, these announcements were made around our decarbonisation way forward from an AGL perspective. And I think the big takeaways from that was the closure of Loy Yang A in 2035. The closure of Bayswater in New South Wales has already been indicated to happen between 2030 and 2033. And then the Liddell closure was imminent. And in fact, I was at Liddell the week before last when the last unit was shut down. And it was quite eerie to see a power station go quiet. I'm sure, Chris, you've experienced that. Not a nice feeling. I mean, a lot of people with tears in their eyes. But if we look back at the Liddell closure, it was, I think it was done pretty well. And, if you speak to people on site, they were very appreciative in terms of how it was managed. The benefit we've got with Liddell is we've got a Bayswater right next door, which could absorb quite a few of the employees from Liddell. So that made it easier. I think we're going to have a different story to tell in a decade and a bit. So in terms of our decarbonisation pathway, as indicated, these are the closures. But I think critical as part of that decarbonisation pathway is what will we do to replace capacity. And so there's a couple of things happening. We've set for ourselves a target of 5 gigawatts of renewables as well as firming capacity by 2030, and then an additional 12 gigawatts by 2036. And important, the mixture between renewables and firming capacity, because as indicated also by a previous speaker, that battery and that capacity during the times when the wind is not blowing, and particularly during peak periods, is quite important. As we move towards this transition, it's very important that we work with local communities, that we work with local stakeholders in government, and then also we've got this commitment as one of the biggest retailers also in Australia to continue to supply affordable and reliable energy. And that for us is quite important as Loy Yang. So as we go through this transition, and I mean transition, we'd like to refer to it as repurposing of what we're doing in the Latrobe Valley and repurposing our site as we move forward. But one of the questions that people ask me on site is that when we announced the 2035 closure is, so what's going to happen with us? So are we going to run this asset into the ground, or are we just going to leave it and let it fall over? And the message is in fact quite the opposite. So when we look at forecasts over the next 10 to 12 years, if you look at energy demand, electricity demand, we're going to have to make sure that we've got a good, reliable plant available to do that. And in fact, we're investing in our plant at this stage to make sure that we can transition orderly through to the 2035 closure. We've recently had an outage on Unit 1. It came back in the last week. Quite significant refurbishment was done. We spent just over $92 million for that refurbishment project, which is a significant investment in that asset. And important that we continue doing that over the next decade to ensure that we can supply the electricity through this transition period. Some of the other takeaways is, and I've mentioned that we will keep close to our stakeholders, and we've got a bit of headroom, we've got some time, but we also know that 12 years goes pretty quick, and we need to make sure that we do this transition right. One of the things is that, we don't have another station along the line, maybe our neighbours next door, but there's not, if you look at musical chairs, we'll probably be one of the last chairs standing. So it's really important to look at this transition, what goes beyond 2035. And we see ourselves a part of that future beyond 2035. So one of the things that we're looking at from a Loy Yang perspective is to repurpose this site into an industrial energy hub. One of the first projects that was announced quite recent is the next phase of the commercialization of the hydrogen energy supply chain project, the HES, as it's known, the HES project, where $2.3 billion was put forward by the Japanese Green Energy Fund to fund that project, and that's a hydrogen from brown coal production. So that's going to go ahead in the next couple of years. We're currently working through the details of what that means for us as a site, also from a coal supply perspective. And then very important is to make sure that, obviously I think the carbon capture is going to be quite critical in terms of the viability of that project post the next phase of setting that up. But apart from that, we're also looking at others. We've also already got approval for progressing our grid scale battery. So that will also happen in the next couple of years. We've recently done a site usage study to see how we can utilize our site. We've got just over 6,000 hectares. We've got services that supply us into site, whether that's water, electricity supply, etc. So I think we're well positioned for setting this as that energy hub. And then also to look at other industries that we can cooperate with, like for instance, construction, etc. So we'd like to see how we can also look at options around that. So as indicated, it's about repurposing, but very important to create a synergistic intra-hub flow. So to also look at other industries and how we can attract them, how they can also utilize the services that we can provide. And it's really about making sure that we align with customer demand to supply as we transition into this future.
Great.
And that's short and sweet from my side.
On the panel, so both our people online can see and also our audience here. I can see that you both speak often and also on a building site, the ability to project is great. So we've heard a lot this evening, both from Mark's perspective, and then we can see some of that, the lessons learned and that
the transition that's happening, the consideration of workforce, the transition and repurposing, as you put it, you know, some entrepreneurial business spirit here, but aligned with, you know, what's needed. So, you know, there's some real food for thought here and some real action that's happening. You know, this is not something that's nebulous. It's going to happen. So what are your questions here this evening of now that we've got, you know, these leaders and experiences here with us?
Mark Richards, I'd probably suggest that one thing we haven't touched on tonight is the net zero authority at the federal level, which will obviously be trying to link up all the states and try to create a process that gives a pathway for all players in the market to achieve something, both in terms of community, workers, and obviously keep the power on. Any commentary maybe from any of the people?
I think it's a question.
And the first thing I want to say is also thank you to the Latrobe Valley Authority. The fact that we had a one-stop shop, people like us when we were retrenched, made a huge difference. We had one place to go for training, we had one place to go for financial advice, one place to talk to Centrelink or any of the other business needs that we needed was available at the one point. And then since then, they then pushed into trying to develop new businesses for us. So to the LVA, thank you. I hope that the National Transition Authority builds from that model and extends it, and then opens up that chance for people then to move to other areas and other options as well. So I welcome it. I think it's a wonderful step forward, and I really hope it's going to help everyone into the future.
Likewise, I mean, when I was at the ACTU, it was one of our core campaigns, and unions have been wanting it for very many years. And hopefully it's, you know, the T word, the transition word, has been a bit of a dirty word. People haven't really wanted to use it. It doesn't really help anyone. Hopefully we can move beyond this idea about, you know, transition being weaponized, and actually it's a project. There's no, it is a process to be managed. It's not an easy thing to manage. So you're better off acknowledging that it's a looming issue and we need dedicated resources. So I think there's some real questions that we don't know the answers to yet around, you know, what's the structure of the authority going to look like? What's the resources going to be? How's it going to work with regional authorities? How's it going to work with communities? Because sometimes governments, particularly federal governments, don't do a lot of sort of community engagement. There's some hard questions for them to resolve, but I'm pretty optimistic. I briefed Prime Minister and Cabinet on the Spanish Just Transition Authority and connected them with the Spanish Just Transition Institute. So I'm pretty confident that they're trying to do the right thing.
Questions there?
Christo, it was good to hear you talk about repurposing up at Loy Yang, right? I think the key to success to any transitioning is that we actually have a destination. When I talk about destination, I'm talking about new industries going forward from there. So thanks for talking about the repurposing, because that gives me a bit of hope, mate.
I think, you know, what's important is that we plot that out, and our intention is to engage particularly local community who's got a vested interest in terms of what happens through our own community forums and community engagement forums, and we'll keep you updated as we progress to, you know, as we start getting that pathway a little bit more clear.
And just on that repurposing, like it's great. When Hazelwood shut, nothing was really proposed for the site. It's great that we know in 4 years' time, 5 years' time, there's going to be a giant battery, actually one of the largest batteries in the world. And, you know, I sort of pointed at some of the things that are kind of world's best practice in Europe, but that's going to be an incredible effect in the valley. And, you know, 4 hours of storage. Like the big batteries that operate in Australia at the moment are 1 or 2 hours of storage. So that's great. If AGL can do the same, like that's some pretty serious, a serious stake in the clean energy economy that the Latrobe Valley has.
Question here. Just
Yeah,
introduce yourself.
Sorry, Lily Wilkins. Question for Mark. You spoke about the building of the turbines in Spain, and in particular, you know, the big ships and the boats and the heavy construction, all of that. Do they look at the life cycle of the carbon footprint? So, you know, are they offsetting? Because, I mean, obviously Spain having signed, or Europe in general having signed the 2015 Paris Agreement, they'll have quite strong legislated net zero targets. So just curious about that.
There's now a turbine recycling industry emerging in Europe as, you know, wind farms that were built 10, 15 years ago are reaching the end of their life. So, you know, the aluminium and the materials are really valuable, so they will be recovered. But in the last time I looked, and it's quite a few years ago now, at the payback time in terms of energy use, how long does it take a wind farm to pay back the energy used? So like a couple of weeks of the wind farm's operation has actually, you know, essentially offset
the construction costs.
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, there's also all the concrete, which wouldn't be trivial as well. But you're building something which is generating large amounts of power for 20 years or more.
My question comes from, I'm Therese Tierney, the chair of the Regional Partnership, and it comes from hearing varied sort of presentations and listening to private sector commitment and other things. And I'm not a particularly structured person, but I'm starting to feel a strong need to understand who's conducting the orchestra around, you know, and did you see examples that might help with that? Because I think that there is a time factor, which means you have to be extremely organised. There is the, you know, different industries have got emission targets, the government has emission targets. And I'm just feeling a strong sense of who's conducting this. So does anyone have a view on that, or have they seen examples that might be useful around that?
Well, in the Spanish example, it was a legislative time frame, and every 5 years you had to have a plan. And, you know, when I met with the person from the Spanish Just Transition Authority, they drank like 3 coffees in 10 minutes because they had to get out there and like get the Just Transition plan for that region finished. You could see that they had a sort of rolling schedule of engagement. So it was the National Transition Authority. I guess it's a smaller country geographically. Maybe it was easier for them to do some of that community engagement. But that's what we need, that level of coordination, investment, supporting regional authorities like Latrobe Valley Authority to be doing it here, etc.
Yes, because some of their efforts seem quite sophisticated, but that comes from a long time working on it. So then the just transition thing sort of appealed to me, and I was just sort of, yeah. So thanks for that. Yeah.
I've just got one question online, which is one I'll see who wants to answer it, and then we'll go to you in the audience there. It's from Laura M. Given it sounds like coal to hydrogen isn't really happening across Europe, so this is to Mark, but anyone else that wants to jump in, why is it being pushed here in the Latrobe Valley as a transition solution, particularly with the challenges we face with mine rehabilitation in this region, as well as the uncertainty around the viability of carbon capture and storage?
I can give it a go.
Sure.
If we look at the position that the Japanese government has taken, obviously they see a lot of potential in this going in hydrogen production going forward. Whether it's utilising renewables with offshore wind and electrolyzers, whether it's taking brown coal and through a gasification process, generate or produce hydrogen. The brown coal to hydrogen production is actually quite an economic option, and that's why they're pushing for that. I think as I've indicated in my talk as well, is that the real challenge is to prove the carbon capture part, and that's going to be pretty critical for this project going forward and being viable. But I'm not privy to their studies that they've done. There were a number of projects that were considered for this funding that was given by the Japanese government. And surely they've done their homework and they've looked at which option for them was the most viable or the most economic. And this particular project came up as the one that they decided to fund and give those funding to. So I think obviously the proof of the pudding is in the eating, so we'll see how that progresses. And then as we go through this phase, obviously we'll continuously keep you informed as well as to how that's progressing.
Yeah, Simon van Niekerk again. Perhaps a question for Christo and David. Just in terms of workforce transition, I imagine the average age of workers at Yallourn and Loy Yang is well over 50 now. So what proportion of your workforce is actually looking to transition to a new career? And the second part is, with the departure of a lot of, in the next 5 years or 12 years in Loy Yang's case, how do you attract younger workers or new workers to fill those positions? I imagine unit controllers are not just pick them off the shelf to operate a unit. How do you attract younger workers when you got a limited lifespan for an asset?
Yeah, I might have a credit. Thanks, Simon, for the question. I think from our perspective, our $10 million training plan, I think, actually provides people with the opportunity to come to Yallourn and actually learn some really good skills on an ageing power plant, essentially, which sets them up for a viable career post Yallourn. We're finding that with certainly our apprentices and younger tradespeople, they want to hang around till the end, learn as much as they can, and then set themselves up for future movement. I think the other thing from a cohort that needs to find roles post closure, the piece that's missing at the moment is really that the thing that we hear all the time from our people is that, look, I really want to plan for my next career. I just need to know what the jobs are. So I think there's still this sort of murkiness around, well, what are the jobs and how many do we have? And it's really about us getting our act together as an industry and locally about providing a bit more clarity about, what that actually could look like into the future.
And there is some terrific work, coordination, call out to our colleagues in the audience involved in skills and training. There's a lot of conversation and active work around this in the region. It seems to me it's about integrating,
Yeah, and that's the other thing. I've never seen this industry work more closely, since we were together as one, essentially.
Yeah.
And we're always talking to existing energy participants. We're talking to renewable energy proponents. So we're actually I think we finally realised that we all need to work together. And there's a lot of opportunities that these new projects provide for our own people. But conversely, there's opportunities that we provide to those projects, particularly through skilled workforce.
Bodhi, you had a question there?
Hi, I'm Bodhi Darville, Latrobe Valley Authority. There's been a really significant and important focus on the conversation tonight around the existing workers and around the Latrobe Valley. I'm interested as well on your thoughts around the broader Gippsland energy transition, and particularly communities that are being asked to host infrastructure that they may not have before, like transmission lines and wind towers and batteries and solar farms. How do we support our broader community through that transition, through the change and the significant consultation and the lots of different requests for being a part of this energy landscape, which they haven't before?
One of the things I've always found is that first and foremost, to be open, be honest and be fair. First thing you should be doing is you always should be looking at what is the world's best practice. If you build a solar farm at the moment, the figures that people will earn is somewhere from $15,000 to $30,000 per turbine that's on their land. When we've done wind farms in the past, we've also shared that to the neighbours as well, so that they were compensated for visual amenity, which they've lost. When it comes to power lines, there's a very different thing. There's been a traditional method of calculations. I've put forward an alternative one to VicGrid, where I've actually asked that we look at instead depreciation of the land, compensation for that, but also recognising that things like powers, like a transmission tower, is going to be in place for 50 to 70 years. So to get a one-off payment does not make sense. It makes far more sense that they are compensated annually for what productive use of that land is lost. These are the type of things that we need to have. We need to make it fair and equitable. We need people to understand the difference of what does it mean if I have a turbine on my land? What does it mean if I have an overhead power line? What does that affect in terms of my farming strategies? Do I need to worry about changing my machinery because it's over height and will cause dangers there? If I have an underground line, does the fact that the area around the cable heat upset the fact of the type of crop that I can grow? The fact that I can't plough deep can make a big difference in the type of crops and the performance that you'll get. So we need to be very upfront, we're honest, and we need to be fair. If we do that, we should be able to move it forward.
Yeah, I think it's also about having genuine engagement with those affected communities as well. That's my medication alarm going off.
Time to get out of bed.
That's right. Thanks, Steve. So it's about having genuine engagement with those impacted communities, and I think being transparent. And I also think if you're from larger companies like ours, it's making sure that the people who are having those conversations are actually locals as well. And yeah, we just work through those issues as we come up. But being open, being transparent, and communicating early, and the engagement needs to be authentic, not just hey, we've done that one, let's move on to it.
Well said, David. And on that note, I mean, these conversations will continue. There are other events happening. Indeed, that the Gippsland Climate Change Network are running, the Festival of Big Ideas, and of course the Gippsland New Energy Conference will take that next step into what it looks like to transition and to engage and work with our whole community. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to especially thank all of our speakers who have come from near and far, indeed, to share perspectives and share your plans, for what's happening. What we're hearing is that people want to know, they want to be involved and understand some of those steps, because that helps community stakeholders to start to make their own plans, in their families, in their industries, etc. So it's been really terrific to have all of you here together. Thank you to Mark for, giving us some of those leading lights, and for, our people locally for starting to make those plans here. So if you could all join me in thanking us.